Well, welcome back onto the Biota Podcast, Jeffrey. Pleasure to chat with you once again. I thought we should have a more informal discussion because we're both artificial life hobbyists, and I've started a new recording series with Emmy Khan. Emmy's currently travelling. So I think you just dropped me an email just at the right time saying you wanted to talk once again. And I thought, well, this is a great opportunity. And you're currently working on vestibular walkers. Am I right in that?
Yeah, it's a new project. Well, it's not so new at this point, that I've been working on for a while. And I'll be presenting it at the upcoming Artificial Life Conference.
Congratulations. So you got that approved. I think that's changed since we last spoke. In terms of the way you do your hobby, if we're talking about us as hobbyists, I think you're a bit more than just a general hobbyist. I was actually reflecting on the first time we met. I think I was giving a talk at SRI in 2009, and you came down, and I seem to recall you were in your car. And we spent a wonderful day just wandering around Palo Alto together. And then we had the talk at SRI. And I also remember coming up and seeing your artist space. I think you played the piano for me while I was in your presence, meeting your wife, obviously, just getting a sense of the space and the place that you do your creative work. In terms of vestibular walkers, how long have you been working on it?
On this project?
Yes.
Oh, gosh. Well, in a sense, my brain was working on it for a few decades, actually. And it does involve various techniques that I've been tinkering with for a while. Genetic algorithms, which I was working on as early as Syracuse University, and then Invitee Media Lab. It was the basis for my thesis project, applying it towards locomotion, physically based locomotion characters. I was working on stuff right about when Carl Sims was doing his stuff.
Certainly.
And in fact, he and I interacted a few times at some dinner parties and so on when I was out there. And, I created this sort of, what did Joe Marks call it? Qualitative physics. And since then, I've become more interested in springs and point masses as a physical system, which is lower level and more troublesome in some cases, but if it's managed well, it can be a really good substrate for physical simulation. So that's what this new simulation is based on, springs and point masses.
Certainly. And in terms of what it's written in and stuff like that, I mean, are you now all Java exclusively?
JavaScript.
Very good. I was quite impressed. I loaded it on my phone. You messaged me that you wanted to talk about it, and I immediately loaded it up. I'd loaded it on my computer previously, but it loaded up on my phone, and my phone didn't even get warm. So that stuff must be moving from strength to strength.
Oh, good. Your phone didn't get warm. That's a good sign. It really doesn't take that much computation if you write everything from scratch.
Certainly.
Right? Using an app, it always comes with lots of features that various app users might or might not need. In my case, if I just write the code from scratch, it's pretty lightweight.
Certainly.
So it runs in the browser.
And in terms of making it open source, is that part of your hobby, or do you still maintain a closed source space?
Well, this will be open source because I do plan to put it on GitHub. Thanks for reminding me. I need to do that before I do the presentation because I want people to come and play with it.
Well, if I should give a plug for GitLab now hosts all my open source and recognizes me as an open source developer. So it's a difficulty between GitHub and GitLab. I still maintain my GitHub account. It's still linked through work, all this other stuff. But the stuff that you get on GitLab that I found fascinating is the continuous integration, continuous development, which means I can work with other developers and just write. Ultimately, this should produce JSON at this point, and this should produce this particular format at this point. So I don't know where you're at with regards to your open sourcing. Have you looked at GitLab at all?
I haven't, but I know you've mentioned it several times, and I may have poked around. Is that who's maintaining that?
It's a good question. I'm not actually. Well, I know who's maintaining GitHub, and that's Microsoft. So my perspective is, as you were unable to put Skype on your computer so we could talk via Skype last time, Microsoft isn't always the smartest technology backer, although with GitHub, I mean, they bought something at the right time, and obviously they've, it was a wise investment choice for what they got out of it. But the thing that I like about GitLab is that they're the second. Sometimes it's best as a long-term Mac user as well, sometimes it's best to use the second technology as opposed to the most popular technology, because they're still hungry and still trying to develop around it. So that's what I like with GitLab, and every so often I give an opportunity to plug it. The stuff they do for me, basically they recognize open source projects, and my stuff's been open source for, nearly 30 years now. So having the ability to be an active open source developer, well, I wish it would mean that the likes of Apple and Intel would use my software more, but it has happened at least once doing that. So It's interesting, actually. I was thinking about this with regards to how we're both hobbyists. My perspective with regards to being a hobbyist has changed in recent years. The fact that I'm just basically developing software for myself. In terms of your own thinking, I mean, I was literally watching YouTube about intelligent agent modeling, and someone name dropped you. I'm like, I don't even know how this guy knows Jeffrey. So in terms of your stuff, do you think of, when you start developing this stuff, are you developing it for yourself primarily, or are you developing it with an end user in mind?
Oh, well, I guess my main motivation is just doing basic research and, creating things that illuminate and inform. At the moment, this is not being developed for game development or anything of that sort. Mm-hmm. It's basically just a research project, but it could move in that direction. And as you know, years ago, I did make some apps for Wiggle Planet, which very similar actually, physical simulation. But no, this project is at the moment, it's just basic research.
Interesting. So I'm going to be talking with Steve Grand later, I think later this month, actually. Yeah, at the end of July. And one of the things about Steve is that he considers himself very much a scientist still. Do you consider yourself a scientist, an artist, both, a hobbyist? Where do you fit in your personal perspective associated with what you're doing?
Oh, well, I'm sort of intentionally working outside of any of those disciplines and, feeding off of them. So certainly not in any institutional sense, as far as employment. It's really a mix.
But the thing that fascinates me about Steve Grand is that he ran a Kickstarter back in 2011, and, that was a few years ago now. And he still has quite an active user base that all put money in from the Kickstarter, are all still following his every word, and think of him very much as a scientist. Now, I did a project called I Am Darwin a long time ago. I think you even recorded a video for I Am Darwin back in the day. It must have been, 10, 15 years ago now. And That's the thing that struck me about Darwin is that he followed the pigeon fanciers. His whole view about science was as much a part of the hobbyist as it was part of the scientist. And that's something that's always stuck with me, that I think of myself more as a kind of pigeon fancier than a proper scientist. But Steve Grant certainly thinks of the stuff that he does still as science. I mean, if you were put on the spot, would you ever say what you did was science or art, or are you just happy just to be dabbling?
Well, I don't think those are the three only options.
Amen.
Yes. Science and art have always been overlapped through the ages, and I think to a large degree these realms of activity have been separated by institutions, academia, and so on. The siloification. But in a sense, science is based on evidence and repeatability, so to some degree, in fact, the Artificial Life conference reviewers for these papers want repeatability in these projects, which is why they want to see code and why they want to make sure that the paper is as accurate and precise as possible, so that someone might be able to take this work and extend on it to continue building the cathedral of science.
Certainly.
So in a sense, by having the paper published, I suppose it is part of the scientific process.
It is interesting that the source code has to be made available as part of actually getting the publication there. The sessions. I mean, this is something that I talked with the A-Life community, the ISIL community, more importantly, about roughly a decade ago, that making your research open source was critical for this kind of stuff. And it's now a requirement, you're saying, for getting your project shown at the A-Life conference?
I don't think it's a requirement, but it seems to be becoming more of an expectation.
Certainly.
As code becomes more open source and it becomes easier for people to develop on these things over the years.
It is interesting. It is interesting. So in terms of what continues to inspire you, obviously the bipedal walking is an inspiration. Are you thinking of migrating it to maybe ants or spiders or something like that in the near future?
Oh gosh, I haven't thought beyond this particular project. I'm so deep into it, but it can certainly go in many directions. The next project that I'm going to be focusing on after this is more particle system based.
Certainly.
And in fact, there's a commonality because with the clusters algorithm that I developed, there are forces between particles. So there can be hundreds and thousands of particles, and based on the forces between them, they cluster into various forms. And those forces, I was told by Frank Delaglio, who I'm doing a project with right now, is the basis of molecular and interatomic forces. So two atoms can have a very small attraction as they get closer, and then once they get to a certain critical closeness, they're repelled by each other. So they find the perfect equilibrium of pairing. And that is, in fact, at the local space, identical to a spring force, which is what I'm using for these creatures. So in a sense, it's all particles and springs in one sense. And so by looking at the whole gestalt of what all of this stuff has in common, it really opens up some doors as far as possibilities, as far as I'm concerned.
So in terms of the movement to open source and open sourceizing what you're doing currently, are you going to borrow from that for the next project, or are you creating a completely new source code repository for the next project?
Well, I'm not thinking so much about code repositories. I guess I'm still thinking, the ideas are I guess what's driving me more than the source code.
Yes.
And, that does bring up an interesting question as far as how I or we or anybody manages their code over a lifespan of developing code over 30 or some years. I've had times where I save parts of my code and reuse them, right? But one interesting thing, and you may have experienced this yourself, is that, after 10 years of you come back to a piece of code, or maybe even a year, you forgot a lot about it.
Oh yeah.
You forgot what you did. And so it takes a while to kind of put your head back into that space. And in fact, your head might be different than it was then anyway.
Almost by definition, yes.
So at times I throw up my hands and say, oh, hell with it. I'm just going to rewrite the code.
Yes.
And sometimes rewriting the code, it ends up being better than before. And in fact, I've experienced while I'm rewriting the code that I'll start to remember bit by bit those things that I was doing before.
Yes.
And it's just an interesting landscape of the mind where the memory of these projects kind of persists, and some of it falls away.
Certainly.
And some of it maintains. So oddly enough, sometimes there's benefit of rewriting code.
It is interesting, actually.
Yeah. I think it depends really on the purpose of the code. And, obviously if there's a community of users on the code, then it's important to maintain it and to keep it persistent. But, when it's a project that's just me doing it myself, then it doesn't matter that much.
Interesting. Yeah, so many thoughts came to me while you were talking about this. The thing that strikes me currently is that Polyworld is a project that I've used historically and integrated with historically, but isn't currently maintained. And really, the kind of source code that I maintain, I've been writing the same source code for 30 years, which is why, unfortunately, I'm stuck in the C language paradigm, which in and of itself is problematic, specifically when folks such as yourself are embracing things like JavaScript in order to get stuff which is visually very attractive and evenly moving.
So it's in C. It's not even C++. Your code.
Believe me, yes.
Yeah. No,
so
I can understand and appreciate that.
Thank you. Few can, but those that can, I appreciate that. But it is an interesting problem because certainly for me, it's maintaining it on operating systems. It's maintaining the Windows code so it runs on Windows. For a period of time, I maintained a Linux version. It was maintaining that, which I could do relatively easily at the time. And now obviously being primarily an Apple-based developer still, unlike you, haven't thrown away those shackles just yet. It's about maintaining within their graphics technology, which, ebbs and flows. And, I rewrote OpenGL. I rewrote an OpenGL library to persist what was OpenGL-ish of my old code and still maintain that to this day, even though I've moved away from Apple's Metal technology. So, I mean, when people start looking at my code, and I occasionally meet people that do still look at my source code, I get a lot of kudos from people for actually still maintaining this thing after however many years. But it's interesting, the idea of the rewrite, because certainly I've come to rewriting parts of my code in Java, in particular when people have asked me to redo code. And I've always thought that JavaScript is probably the next paradigm to write it in. But yeah, certainly seeing your development, getting a sense of that. And how many languages have you been through?
Oh gosh, well, I started with BASIC, and then Pascal, and then C, I did C++, and then I guess Java. I was doing some applets for a while. I'm actually doing some C# right now in Unity for a VR project. So yeah, I guess I've picked up several languages. Never touched Fortran, and I haven't done. I haven't used any of the newer modern languages, the functional programming languages. I haven't quite fallen into that way of thinking. I'm still pretty procedural, and I like object-oriented. C# is a good language, and JavaScript. I'm used to it. It's not like I'm thrilled about it, but I've gotten accustomed to it, and it's so very lightweight and easy to develop. And deploy.
And it works so well. I mean, it's one of these things. I think I was tracking software that maintains itself, basically, and writing in JavaScript, actually, apparently you get at least 20 years worth of JavaScript compiler benefits, and it's still, stuff that was written 20 years ago still runs flawlessly. Yeah.
So that's good.
Yes. So, in terms of your future, any plans on the horizon other than this particular, let's call it the particular project, for want of a better term? Is that the next thing that's going to be a open source application? It's not open source, right? It's just visualization.
Are you talking about this Walker project?
No, the particle physics stuff that you were talking about, the springs.
Yes. I intend to do a revamp of the clusters algorithm. In fact, I'm developing it in VR right now in 3D. It's basically similar to what I did with Leap Motion when I was doing a project with them, and they had some really brilliant programmers working to get my particles system working on the graphics card GPU so that it was very fast. So they had lots and lots of particles. So I'm not there at the moment, and for that reason, I'm interested in maybe putting a toe into the ocean of shaders and things of that sort. A lot of voodoo down there, but I think it might be worth it to get some more oomph in this thing.
I'm not sure if you heard my conversations with Anton Mikhailov in the podcast feed, but Anton is a firm believer in using GPU technology, and it was interesting actually talking to him as he was implementing artificial life in those technologies, that he was actually hitting the boundaries quite frequently. And that's one of the interesting things with regards to kind of sticking your toe in the water of these various technologies, is you tend to find how far you can go relatively quickly if you're writing A-Life software.
Yeah. I haven't explored it yet, but I have a couple of friends who are braver than I am and have done some shader work. So I might go out and have a beer with them, learn a bit more about it.
Very good. Very good. Well, in talking about a hobby, I wanted to talk about something that I was planning on talking with Imi Khan about, but I thought, since I've got Jeffrey on the line, I've got this brilliant opportunity to talk about this as well. And speaking of, I mean, I think the thing that strikes me is I've been incredibly lucky in knowing people such as yourself and kind of knowing polymaths out there who I can occasionally jam with and find, interesting topics to talk about. One of the things that's always fascinated me is the Second World War for a variety of reasons. But it's the use of simulation in determining aspects of the Second World War, possibilities, and actually trying to find, new. As we talk about finding science out of these art projects, finding history out of these art projects as well is something that's always interested me. So I started a project, probably my daughters weren't yet born, so it was probably about 4 years ago, to simulate London in 1940, because you can actually get full maps of London in 1940, beautiful, high-resolution, detailed maps, which, with my background, was just absolutely fascinating. So I bought half a dozen of these, well, probably close to 9 of these maps to a relatively high resolution from the University of Scotland, and paid my money and got my PNG files and zoomed them in. And then, thankfully, my long-term kind of software co-author, Bob Mottram, who I mentioned at the SRI talk, that was how long ago he and I have been working together, was able to give me about 6 months of his time and wrote a JSON parser so he could turn these high-resolution maps into JSON. And then you have a really interesting data problem, because you have a high-resolution map of London, and also you have a telephone directory from that time. But the telephone directory is unfortunately owned by British Telecom or Ancestry.com. Both Ancestry.com and British Telecom own the rights to the telephone directory. So I had the ability of knowing this exact building was a baker. This exact building made plates, metal plates. This exact building made ceramic plates. This exact building made wooden plates. And I started looking for all the professions, because this is ultimately, the technology of the time that made ceramic plates was totally different to the technology of the time that made wooden plates. And actually the professions that go into doing that, like literally the people that weigh the clay and this kind, I mean, this is obviously, your partner's, your partner's particular interest as well. But the nature of all these different things each of them required half a dozen to a dozen professions. So you could then develop agent models around these various professions, which I found was fascinating. You could then develop an economic distribution over London. So, there's more likely that there are jewellery stores in particular areas than there are bakeries. I could never get the telephone directory, which was my great frustration, because if you get the telephone directory, then you get the what's called in this country a zip code. I don't know. I think they call them postcodes in England. And you can then say, okay, definitively this store made shoes, or definitively this was a tenement block where people lived. And you could start creating these aspects of simulation. So London as a simulated entity is a really interesting thing to kind of project onto, because you have a huge number of historians. I've got a close friend who walks London and creates YouTube videos as he walks various eclectic parts of London. So for me, London was never a second home or anything like that. It was just a place that I went to periodically. But I've got really fascinated in this data set. Now, the data set itself is difficult because there are no right angular buildings within London. And you've got the exterior of the buildings, but you don't have the interiors. Now, I've written historically a means of interpolating interiors in buildings. So that wasn't particularly hard. But there were kind of 3 or 4 orders of magnitude problems that I encountered. And obviously having Bob Mottram trying to solve them in parallel was really interesting. But it all came back to simulating sea line, because obviously in 1940, London wasn't a peaceful place, right? It was under attack almost continuously by the Luftwaffe and just the threat. I mean, Hitler made very few jokes, but the jokes he did make tended to be around how he was going to scare the English people in his speeches. Right. So so anyway, I got into this history. This is the past 4 years of my life, basically. Now, there was something very interesting that also occurred over the past 4 years, and that's COVID. So COVID created an environment where I could get access. So literally, arm's length away, I have a Home Guard directory, which is a top secret, or was at the time a top secret document, which details every single, Home Guard in the towns in the southeast of England that they lived in and this kind of stuff. And it's interesting, actually, the professions of the people that joined the Home Guard. And also, similarly at arm's length, I have a bunch of books about Home Guard-related training. So when you're modelling agents, you want to get to the fundamentals of the agent modelling as close as you can get. And with the Home Guard, I became very familiar, firstly with their crew recruiting practices, but also with regards to the kind of professions that they were looking to recruit. So you have this fascinating history. And the interesting thing is this moves to mythology very quickly. Looking at a lot of this stuff, I mean, we're talking about, London not being able to get the data set to know which building is a baker. Well, the Home Guard, they're maintained by, there must be 500 of these societies in England that maintain local regional reference. Like this church was bombed at a specific time. What kind of church was
Yeah.
it? It was a Catholic church. Okay, that was interesting. When was it bombed?
Yeah.
Oh, we don't know. Somewhere in the past 5 years between these dates and these dates. So you end up with even pillboxes, right? Pillboxes are really central in the defence of England. They built in just the London area about 250 pillboxes, probably closer to 500 actually. But of the ones that are still there, there are about 200 that are still actively maintained. As some of them they grow gardens out of. I mean, it's really interesting what has happened to the pillboxes of London. And I'm part of the Pillbox Society. I joined a bunch of these different groups, including the 20th Century Society. The 20th Century Society is a non-government organisation based out of London that represents the architecture of this period, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So you get all these fascinating layers, but the thing that got really scary was associated with regards to what was happening on the other side of the channel. Now, there's a whole bunch of statistics that people use in this country more than anywhere else, but they talk about how, the Luftwaffe operated. They talk about how the Waffen-SS operated. They talk about why the Luftwaffe in particular had a historically large number of kills. Most of the time, people thankfully weren't killed in this circumstance. Most of the time, they were able to get out of the planes before they were, before they landed or crashed or what have you. But the amount of data that is just in the history texts associated with what the Luftwaffe was versus what the British were in the Battle of Britain, fascinating stuff. So through COVID, there was I don't even know how one would describe it. It was a perfect time to buy books, basically. Okay. There were books available, very reasonably priced books. So I bought every possible book I could buy about the Home Guard, and hence I can reach out and touch Home Guard, teaching submachine guns, teaching machine guns, teaching all these different things. There were, at the time, probably more than 24 different Home Guard booklets that were sold internally within England, which trained them about house-to-house fighting and a bunch of additional things. Like the Home Guard booklets that they were literally, you've got 5 pages of ads and 10 pages of Home Guard information, then 5 pages of ads. They were just advertising booklets, but they were for people that were interested in joining or learning about the Home Guard. So you've got both the official stuff that the British government provided, and then you've got the unofficial stuff that was provided by all these businesses at the time. So from an agent-based simulation perspective, this whole thing was fascinating because I was able to get primary book, literally a book that was classified. I was able to buy classified documents as an individual through the COVID period, which was absolutely stunning. Now, the problem that I discovered more than anything, because this is unfortunately what my daughters are going to inherit, is that I bought a wide variety of German books as well through that period of time. One gets to a certain level with the Home Guard, and then you want to understand why the Luftwaffe was so good at what it was doing. Well, a part of that is propaganda, right? Part of that is not real. It's just, the German propaganda machine was well noted and documented through the Second World War and came to become the US propaganda machine, pretty well after the Second World War. But the fascinating thing I found through this, which I haven't read, I've read a lot of Second World War histories. My father's Jewish. My family on his side fought in the Second World War. One of my great uncles passed away in India, of all places, through the Second World War. He had malaria poisoning. So I've gone back and found death camp records for my family. I've done a bunch of different things with history. But the history that I read through this period of time, and this is primarily German books, is associated with how they recruited children. How they recruited children both with the Waffen-SS, but also the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe recruited children as young as 14 to 16 to fly these planes. And I have these books now. I have literally a 16-year-old's collection of books as he was trained in the Waffen-SS. I have a photo album of him flying in these planes. The amount of photos that I was able to obtain through this period of time is just fascinating. But it portrays a very bleak, and you don't want to be in the mindset of what happened through the Second World War in this ride. But I got to this kind of extreme where now literally I have, collections of books that my daughters will probably never understand. The movement from, you're familiar with the Cub Scouting movement in this country, I'm sure.
The what movement?
The Boy Scout movement here.
Yeah,
You may have heard this, you may not have heard this, but if you attain an Eagle Scout level, you can get into the American military at a higher pay grade than if you're not an Eagle Scout. You may not know
really?
that. Yeah.
Okay.
The Waffen-SS did that as well. There's a transition, the 12th Division of the Waffen-SS that were all children. They went through the equivalent of the Cub Scouts, the Hitler Youth as it was called there, and became Waffen-SS, which you're probably familiar with some aspect of the history of the Second World War, and that they were designated a terrorist group in Nuremberg and these kind of things. So I actually have in my collection the little booklet that was published in 1940 by some bureaucrat in Germany, which instituted how the Hitler Youth, or equivalent of ideological Cub Scouts fundamentally, would become the Waffen-SS. And it's very bleak and curious reading, and it's very bleak and curious reading to hold this in my hands. It took me about 4 months through the COVID period to actually get that book. But I basically collected a series of these books thinking that it was going to be for an agent modeling simulation, fundamentally.
Yeah.
And I got relatively close to that. And then my long-term colleague, Bob Mottram, his father passed away, sadly. Bob Mottram's father was an amazing botanist, an amateur botanist who was very much of science fundamentally. I've got a book of his, which is literally, I don't know, it's about 300 pages of just reference material of the various cactuses he found. He was a cactus and succulent expert.
Wow. Oh, that's cool.
So absolutely fascinating. So anyway, so unfortunately Bob Mottram's father passed away. Bob Mottram is caught in a bunch of different open source projects that he's working on, but he's not working on any of mine soon. I thought, okay, let's move it back from simulating Sea Lion. Let's move it back to simulating London in 1940. Let's keep it upbeat and happy. Well, it's actually still remarkably interesting. I've recorded a podcast, put this out, got a podcast listener to get back in contact with me. And he said, why are you looking to model football hooliganism? Which was actually part of this as well. Football hooliganism, I'm not sure if you're familiar with English football hooliganism, but they all fight differently in the various parts of London, fundamentally, that they're from. They all use different fighting techniques. There was University of Leicester, a football hooligan study group, people of whom I've corresponded with. No, fascinating stuff through the 2000s. They were able to get money.
I would never have thought of that as a subject, but fascinating.
Yes, so they're familiar with various football hooligan fighting styles, and actually they created half a dozen video games through that period of time of football hooligans fighting it out. So when I put this out in a podcast maybe about 2.5 years ago, I got an email from someone who I hope is still a listener to this podcast, saying, why are you studying football hooliganism? That seems like a very silly thing to study as you're trying to simulate London in 1940. But, you know, it's really, and I want to shout out, actually, we have a Discord server currently for the Biota podcast. You just go to biotacast.org and click on the Discord link. I'm having communications with people that have been listeners to this podcast for the past 18 years, which is just a luxury. We've been doing this for a long time, Jeffrey.
Yeah.
And we've gathered a lot of fascinating people through that period of time that listen to us.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Football hooliganism. Fascinating. So where are you now in terms of your, looking at the history of London in that period and simulation?
So I had twin daughters.
Yes. Okay. That's a good answer.
My view is that it's basically Bob Mottram's work got to a period of time. We talked about GitLab early on. I wrote a lot of GitLab, CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous development to make sure that Bob Mottram's stuff wouldn't break the London 1940 environment that I created. But really, this is something more for probably a privileged listener out there to go back and discover. All the source code and all the maps are still on GitLab.
Yeah.
So the idea is that sometime in the next 20 years, I'm sure you do this too in your own mind, sometime in the next 20 years, I'll be in a position where I can revisit this very interesting block of data. And that's where I'm thinking of it, that maintaining it as I have and maintaining it in the environment that I've maintained it in means that someone can come and literally kick off where Bob Mottram left off. You know, someone who's obsessive. Bob Mottram is a highly detailed, oriented, obsessive personality, very similar to me, probably very similar to you in some light as well. And it takes a particular kind of person to come to this data set and start exploring it. And I realized I started looking at neural networks as a means of actually building better buildings, building both the external and the internal, because the real difficulty was actually getting these structures. Just the external parts of the buildings were difficult enough. So there are still probably 20 problems to be solved just in doing the proper exterior of the buildings, which I hope the 20th Century Society in London would be able to do, but this is all out of their remit. It's also taught me that people in the UK, firstly, aren't interested in talking about the Second World War. They're not interested in returning to it in any fashion. London 1940 is an eclectic data set for a group of people, but I don't know, it just will require the right people to kind of fall into my lap, so to speak, which I've had the luxury of doing over the past 30-odd years. So my view is that the data set is there. Given the opportunity somewhere in the next 20 years, I'll re-explore it. But that's the nature of these projects, right? We create them, we put them out there, we wait for the right, for the planets to align and for things to get perfect.
Well, there's also the possibility, you mentioned neural nets. There's also the possibility that some point in the future, an AI system like ChatGPT or some AI that's able to digest various databases and maps and sources of information will be put to use to recreate some of the stuff.
That's my hope.
And that brings up some of the fascinating discussions about AI and how, in my mind, it will play a part in the future of history making. Because history is an interpretation of the past based on information. And the information that was available to a historian 100 years ago was quite limited compared to now.
Certainly.
In addition to that, the information that we have currently coursing through the internet and on servers and in books and everywhere is vast, and a lot of it is disinformation or misinformation Certainly. As well.
Yes.
So the job of the historian, in a sense, is more complex, but vastly rich and available. So, I have a personal interest in how history will the process of creating history will change because of the information age. And so perhaps London in the 40s will be recreated in simulations, as the way you're thinking, in an amazing way. And it may not be perfect. Obviously, it won't be perfect, but it'll be a pretty good guess.
Yes. Well, that's my hope.
Given the power of AI.
And it's interesting, actually, because I've had the best discussions with Second World War history, or the best discussion about Second World War history, with ChatGPT. It adds a breadth of knowledge, which means you can talk about the nuances of Nuremberg. Nuremberg is a fascinating, set of examples and counterexamples, and what does free speech mean according to the Nuremberg laws, and all this other kind of stuff. And I think it's interesting that these large language models, as they are currently, are able to dig into history in a relatively dynamic way currently, or at least Wikipedia written history. But as you say, the nuances of history are not lost on most of us now. And these nuances, in fact, probably play a greater role than anything. In terms of in terms of the way you've explored this, we live some of that in terms of the software we develop and the stuff that we've experienced through our relatively short programming lifetimes. But what aspect of history fascinates you the most through this?
Oh, well, I'm fascinated with prehistory, actually. Human civilization before there was such a thing as a historian. Because all we have is archaeology and preservation of certain genetic information, I suppose, in fossils and so on. And so reconstructing a human community in Indonesia in thousands of years ago would be a very fascinating project. And that you can't use Wikipedia for that, but you can use various other sources and make guesses. And I think it's it may be a matter of how well the guesses are. Some of them will be very vague, but I'm just interested in how history might be reconstructed. Similarly, from reading Richard Dawkins' The Ancestor's Tale, discussing the human genome and the genomes of various species. There's so much progress is being made right now in terms of finding out about species. And in a sense, I think one thing that Richard Dawkins said that really struck with me was every cell in your body has a history book.
Certainly.
Every cell in your body has an array of information in the form of genes that can be used to determine lots and lots of information. And that information is just kind of growing very fast right now.
Yes. The idea of genetics as a story, I think, makes so much sense in terms of it is a kind of paradigm-breaking means of looking at a relatively complex set of problems. But yes, certainly that has stuck with me too.
Yes, you can think about, consider junk DNA, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the amount of junk DNA, and the junk DNA has a story to tell.
Certainly.
If it could be found. It's not, it may be useless and currently, but there's a story there. And finding the leftover crap that is not used anymore can be very interesting.
Certainly. And we have dogs to think about, specifically in terms of the amount of junk DNA that humans have been able to, through breeding projects and a variety of other things, create a wide variety of very curious creatures through that process.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, Jeffrey, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you. Any final topics, any final thoughts before we wrap this thing up?
Oh, no. All I can say is that I'm totally finishing up a video, or trying to finish up a video about this artificial life project, and I'll be presenting it in a few weeks. And there will be a video available. I'm not sure how public that video will be to people not attending the conference, but I think it will be made public. So I'll definitely let you know when the conference is done, and I'll share everything I can.
Very good. I maintain a video of when Apple first displayed my work in 2003 at the WWDC conference. So my view is, irrespective, and obviously Apple is incredibly secretive, well, not secretive is not the right term, incredibly protective associated with the history of their intellectual property, even when they're showing the intellectual property of others. So it's one of these things where something can be created publicly or privately. When it's created privately, I still occasionally, when I find the right kind of polymath in my life who would be interested in seeing my simulation work run in 2003 by a bunch of Apple engineers who were talking about optimizing it for their specific processor, which obviously is just completely lost now in history, I still present them the video. So if you could do that, if you can keep your own copy of the video somewhere and present it to a small selection of folk, for example, the Discord server that I've been able to set up with regards to these podcasts, I think there's ways of getting information out, even if it is proprietary.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah, and I also have started putting things on the archive as well. So that's I'll be putting the video there.
A pleasure as always, Jeffrey. Great chatting with you today.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom.
Take care.
All right.